Class is in session, and the subject is hydropower.
Welcome back to Hydro 101, everyone's favorite and only mini-series of DAM, the official podcast of Northwest Hydropower. I'm your host, Austin Rohr, and I manage all things communications here at Northwest River Partners. Hydro 101 aims to break down the complexities of hydropower at a basic level and help you better understand how our favorite energy resource works. As always, I remind everyone that these podcasts are meant to cover topics at a very basic level. We aren't getting too deep into the weeds or diving into specifics because that's what regular episodes of DAM serve to do. These podcasts should, however, help listeners get up to speed on topics that we regularly cover and fill in knowledge gaps to provide better context for our regular discussions. They can also serve as an excellent educational resource for introducing someone to hydropower in an audio format. I've been out and about talking with people in communities across the Northwest recently, and we've been having some really engaging conversations. One thing that has really stood out to me in particular is that for as much as we discuss the magnitude of hydropower, nobody really knows what a megawatt is. The closest terms you may be familiar with are watts in a light bulb or kilowatt hours on your energy bill. And sure, listing off numbers in the thousands of megawatts sounds impressive, especially when paired with a term like megawatt. But it lacks substantive context for most. Here in the Northwest, we add that context back by talking about how many cities the size of Seattle you could power with X amount of megawatts. And for the record, it's roughly somewhere around 1,000 megawatts per Seattle, give or take a few hundred megawatts because the math isn't exactly perfect. You'll soon learn, though, that megawatts per Seattle isn't an official unit of measurement. So let's get on with this and answer the question, what is a watt? The origin of this term can be traced back to a man by the name of James Watt, who was an 18th century Scottish inventor, mechanical engineer, and chemist. He is most noted for his contributions to developments in steam engines, including the Watt engine, but the unit of measurement actually came after his time as a way to honor him and his contributions. Ironically enough, Watt is responsible for another unit of measurement that many are familiar with, horsepower. And the name Watt was proposed by another man, William Siemens. It was originally referred to as an international watt, though, until the 11th General Conference on Weights and Measurements decided in 1960 to officially declare the unit an absolute watt. Now, I could regurgitate a much lengthier version of that history to you, including the finite details as to how and why it wasn't until 1960 that we arrived at a settled number. But to be frank, a lot of that goes way over my head, and unless you have a strong understanding of electricity and or electrical engineering, it would probably go over yours too. And also remember that this is Hydro 101, after all. What I can tell you is that the end result of all of that is that we arrived at a place where a watt is considered a measure of power, or more specifically, the measure of the rate of flow of energy. That rate comes out to 1 joule per second. And again, we'd actually need to be doing an entirely different podcast than Hydro 101 if we wanted to properly break down what a joule is. This podcast is titled, What is a Watt? So instead, we're going to continue to focus on that. But to boil it down to a sentence, a joule is a measure of energy itself at a fundamental level. Now, more importantly, the takeaway here is that a watt measures the speed of energy, kind of like a mile per hour, or more appropriately, a kilometer per hour. And that's because watts are international units as opposed to imperial units, which in layman's terms means that they're metric as opposed to standard. We'll dive back into that one a little later, though. Based on the speed or rate of energy, we can understand how powerful an energy generator is, or how much energy something will consume. Today's common household LED light bulbs, for example, require a much lower wattage than a traditional incandescent bulb. And for example's sake, we're just going to make it easy and say that this hypothetical LED bulb is rated at 10 watts. That means that it will consume 10 joules per second. The incandescent bulb it replaced would have likely been rated at 60 watts, or 60 joules per second. If that sounds like a lot, it's really not. In revisiting the metric system we discussed just earlier, it takes 1,000 watts to equal 1 kilowatt, and it takes 1,000 kilowatts to equal 1 megawatt. And again, because this is the metric system, it takes 1,000 megawatts to equal 1 gigawatt. And it takes 1.21 gigawatts to power a time-traveling DeLorean. A fun fact that I actually learned in double-checking that I had my Back to the Future reference correct here is that they were indeed saying the car required gigawatts and not a made-up unit of measurement known as a gigawatt. However, there was apparently a mix-up about how to pronounce gigawatt, and hence the pronunciation gigawatt was born. Perhaps if they had time-traveled far enough into the future, specifically after the publication of this podcast, they would have been more up to speed on watts, and thus not made such an error. Then again, I almost certainly wouldn't be off on this tangent in the first place if that were the case. Outside of fiction, though, there are a lot of other terms for watts, and to be fair, if you look them up, they sound just about as made up as a gigawatt. However, in the world of energy and hydropower, we can really focus in on kilowatts and megawatts, as that's what you're going to see most often when we're talking about energy generating resources. They are often represented as kW and MW. We can also pivot back to those light bulbs and start to wrap our heads around what those watts really add up to. Another good household example would be a microwave. You may see that instructions for cooking with microwaves vary by the watt rating. A 1000 watt microwave is less powerful than a 1200 or 1500 watt model. By that logic, though, you might think that a 10 watt bulb is less powerful than the 60 watt bulb. But that actually points to the efficiency of LED over incandescent technology and its ability to produce about the same amount of light with less energy. And all of this talk about how powerful things are isn't because they generate or produce power, but because they draw more or less watts. It's important to remember this because if something can produce the same results using less watts, or simply put, be more efficient, that doesn't make it less powerful necessarily. So even though I compared a watt to miles per hour because it measures the speed of energy traveling, it can also be compared to miles per gallon in the context of looking at how many watts an item uses. To put all of this into even greater context than that, when you receive your energy bill, you won't see individual watts. Instead, you'll see something called kilowatt hours. And to be clear, a kilowatt is not the same as a kilowatt hour. Remember that a kilowatt is just 1,000 watts. And we know that a watt is 1 joule per second. But light bulbs and microwaves and most things that consume energy do so for greater than 1 single second. The watts and kilowatts capture the rate of consumption, but not the total usage. Since we've already referenced vehicles a lot, I'll stick with the theme here. The kilowatt could be seen as maybe the rate that gasoline flows into an engine, but a kilowatt hour measures the total amount of gas emptied from the tank. In other words, a 1,000 watt or 1 kilowatt microwave over the course of 1 hour would come to 1 kilowatt hour. You just simply have to multiply the kilowatt rating of something by the number of hours it's running, and you have the kilowatt hours. Also, I really hope nobody is microwave something for an hour or longer at full power. Remember when I said that a light bulb sounded like it used a lot of energy? Well, over the course of 24 hours, a 10 watt LED bulb would only amount to 0.24 kilowatt hours. With the Northwest's low energy rates, that would probably cost anywhere from 1 to 3 cents per day, according to my math. Did I mention that I'm in communications and not math? Either way, this isn't an excuse or an endorsement, by the way, for leaving the lights on in unoccupied spaces, but since I brought up the Northwest and its low energy rates, this is probably a good time to segue into hydropower and those megawatts that we're always talking about. See, when we talk about the rating of an energy generating resource, that rating refers not to the amount of watts consumed, but the amount produced. A hypothetical dam rated at 10 megawatts produces 10 million watts of energy. Or does it? Again, there's some distinctions that we have to make here. Energy generation is rarely 100% steady, especially not when the unit of measure is based in seconds. And as we've discussed many times, supply and demand on the grid must be in perfect balance by the second. Even a resource capable of producing a consistent output wouldn't necessarily do so because energy consumption may not be high enough to warrant it. For that reason, when we're talking about something like a dam, we have to look at both the capacity, or maximum amount of megawatts it can produce, and also the actual output. The capacity, according to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's power supply page, a page we heavily reference, is similar to describing the horsepower of a resource, as in the unit of measurement brought to us by none other than James Watt. I told you earlier it was ironic, didn't I? If we look to Grand Coulee Dam, we can see that the capacity is rated at 6,800 megawatts, specifically 6,809 megawatts. But again, since a dam doesn't run at full capacity around the clock, its actual output is lower. Looking to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council once again, we can see that the average annual output for Grand Coulee Dam is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,300 megawatts. Much like how a kilowatt hour is utilized to measure the rate of kilowatt consumption, measuring the output of megawatts from a generating resource is commonly done so by averaging the annual output of megawatts. That is then referred to as an average megawatt. There are also megawatt hours, but we don't see those used necessarily as often, so we're not going to go into great length talking about those. Though what I will say is that if you were to look at a megawatt hour and a kilowatt hour, what you would see is that it's roughly the same concept, but again, scaled up by the metric system. When we compare capacity against output, it sort of makes capacity seem inflated or exaggerated. Again, with Grand Coulee, we have a capacity of 6,800 megawatts and an output of 2,300 megawatts, which, by comparison, it's a pretty substantial difference. However, what's important to recognize is that, again, the consumption of energy is not steady. So, when energy demand rises, a resource may need to push towards its maximum capacity and sustain that level for however long is necessary until demand wavers. The storm in January of 2024 is a perfect example. Demand for energy rose steadily as people sought to keep their homes warm through the cold, snow, and ice. And that was met with an influx of hydropower, as dams used the water available to them to increase the production of energy to help meet that demand. That is to say that the hydropower system ramped up closer to what its capacity might be as opposed to what its average annual output might be in order to meet the increased demand. Now, why all of this matters is because it helps contextualize the way that we communicate about hydropower and other generating resources, which is often by looking at capacity more so than annual output. And now we can sort of work backwards to understand the magnitude of energy we're really dealing with. Comparing multiple sources, the general consensus is that 1 megawatt, or 1,000 kilowatts, is capable of powering somewhere between 750 to 1,000 average American homes, consuming an average amount of energy. Obviously, homes and their energy usage vary widely though, so you'll have to pardon the qualifiers here. The generating capacity of the Northwest hydropower system is rated at 34,000 megawatts. So mathematically, that comes out to a range of 25 million to 34 million average US homes that can be powered by our hydropower. But looking around, it's easy to see that our communities are made up of a lot more than just houses, as far as the eye can see, and things like manufacturing and data centers require a lot of energy compared to, say, a standard house. We also can realistically assume that the hydropower system doesn't run at its 34,000 megawatt capacity round the clock. In fact, we know it doesn't. And that's the thing that makes this all so tricky. While we can define what a watt is, we can scale it up to kilowatts, megawatts, and gigawatts, and we can make generalized comparisons to try and wrap our heads around what they represent. The real world is a lot more complicated, and so is maintaining that perfect balance of supply and demand. In fact, it's far more complicated than Hydro 101 and its host could ever hope to do proper justice. That's why, after all, we have entire agencies, organizations, and utilities with countless engineers and scientists who are trained to understand those nuances and complexities and keep our lights on round the clock. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic than what I've covered on today's podcast, those are probably the best resources to look to. Clearly, I leaned on them a lot throughout this episode to put it together myself. Ultimately, though, I hope that this episode was helpful in trying to better understand what a watt is, and beyond that, why thousands of megawatts of energy is truly an impressive amount for our hydropower system. I also hope that you were able to take down some notes if you had questions or wanted to dive deeper into anything I mentioned here. While this podcast is technically just me rambling into a microphone, I see this as a conversation. Let's not let it be one-sided. I invite you to reach out to us with those questions and interests using the contact form on NW River Partners if you do want to have that conversation. We're also happy to take your questions and feedback on anything else, as well as suggestions for future episodes on topics and guests here on DAM. Likewise, you can email us directly at info@NW River Partners to avoid having to go through the contact form. Of course, I hope you enjoyed today's podcast and gained something valuable from it. If you did, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite listening platform, subscribing to DAM, and turning on notifications so you'll know when we upload new episodes every other Friday. Finally, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X, all under NW River Partners. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more episodes of the regular DAM podcast, so until then, see ya.